Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Devops.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong and ServiceNow. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead of us, but first, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes. First off, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude the live webinar today. If you have any questions for our panel members, we want you to go ahead and submit those using the Q&A tab on the right side of the screen. And for any general discussion that you'd like to have with the rest of your audience members, I'll point your attention to the chat tab. Finally, at the conclusion of our webinar, we will be giving away 24 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. So our topic today is the SRE role today and in the future, and I'm joined by my colleague, Mitch Ashley, Principal of Techstrong Research. Mitch is going to be leading our discussion today, so I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to him to introduce the rest of our speakers. Thank you for being here, Mitch.
Awesome, Cody. Thank you very much for kicking us off. And just a reminder, we're recording. So if you want to take some notes, great. If you want to jot a few things down, share it with a friend later, you'll be getting a link to that recording. So this is a kickoff of a new series that we've been in production with for a while called the SRE Show. It's a very popular topic because a lot of really great people have been doing some kind of seminal work and helping make this happen and elevating the role. And that's what we're going to be exploring today is site reliability engineering. Sometimes we say system reliability engineering. I think reliability and engineering is probably where the emphasis is. We're going to be talking about that, and I'm very fortunate to be joined by three super intelligent folks. I want to call out our partners, the sponsors of this program, who is Lightstep, it's a ServiceNow company, and Austin Parker is my co-host, partner in crime, if you will, in helping put this content together. And of course, he's a frequent speaker, author, well-known in this area. I'm going to start out with introductions, and Parker, ask if you would introduce yourself first.
Yeah, sure. So, hi, everyone. I'm Austin Parker. I head up the developer relations team at Lightstep. I've done quite a few things. I actually kind of cut my teeth in what now we would call SRE, before we called DevOps and platform engineering in a lot of ways. But since then, I have been a maintainer on several open source projects around observability. I've written a book on distributed tracing, and I've run a DevOps conference in Animal Crossing, all of which I think illustrate important skills for SREs today and in the future. So I'm really excited to be a part of this series, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion today.
Fantastic. Thanks again. Good to be partnering with you, Austin. Liz, we've been trying to work together, get you on one of our panels. We've finally made that happen. I couldn't be happier. Would you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. Hi, my name is Liz Wong Jones, and I am a principal developer advocate at Honeycomb for the SRE and observability communities. And you may have seen me before on the SRE versus DevOps series published by Google a couple of years back. That was work that I did to kind of publicize what SRE is, what SRE isn't, at least in Google's view. But my views have kind of evolved since then because I've gone to a smaller company, Honeycomb, which is a 100-person startup, which is very, very different than Google. So it's been really exciting for me seeing the field of SRE evolve, the definitions of SRE evolve, both in that capacity as well as being on the steering committee of SRECon, which is one of the kind of premier conferences about site reliability engineering practice.
Amazing. Fantastic. So glad you're here. Brian, last but not least, would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Brian Lickasar. I go by Litko. I'm a solution architect here at Stormforge. We're a startup very similar to Honeycomb size-wise, and we focus on performance analysis and optimization of Kubernetes-based environments. Prior to that, I was at AWS, where I got to interact with a lot of our SREs in different ways and see how they run inside of a big cloud provider. I imagine very similar to what you experienced at Google. And prior to that, I was at Red Hat and Confluent as well. So I've been in the open source space in and out for quite some time. And prior to that, I was a systems administrator. I think we called ourselves that. I can't quite remember, back in the 90s. Installed Linux off floppy disks that long ago. So I've been in and around the space for a very long time and seen how the necessity of what SREs do has always been there, but maybe never called out or never articulated as well as it is today. I mean, shoot, there's books on it now. I think there's courses at universities, especially free ones online now. That's so phenomenal. I really wish that was there about 25 years ago, selfishly speaking, but nonetheless, I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks for having me.
Welcome. Yeah, I remember my first Linux from Slackware. That's going back a ways, right? The early days. Fantastic. Well, we have a pretty broad audience, and some folks are, been involved in SRE. Maybe that's their job. Other people are kind of like, we should be doing this, or what is it? How do we get started with it? So we wanted to start out with, to give everybody a common base to work from, because we've got so much depth and experience on the panel. Develop not a perfect, but a working definition of what SRE is. Maybe the first question, is it still site reliability engineering? If we've evolved past that? Anybody want to take a shot? And it doesn't have to be right. We'll build from whatever you start us with. Who would like to kick us off on a working definition of SRE?
I can at least give a history of why it's called site. It's called site because originally the website was google.com, and that's kind of why Google coined that term. I definitely think that there is a valuable role for systems engineering as a broader discipline that is included in SRE. But really fundamentally, as you said at the beginning, Mitch, it's about the reliability piece. How do we ensure that we're building reliable, resilient, and scalable systems?
Yeah, I would kind of broadly agree with that. SRE is funny to me as a term because it's funny in the same way like DevOps or Agile is a term, because we're really taking a convenient demonym to sort of classify all these different things that don't really have a ton of in common, and in order to kind of credentialize it in a lot of ways, right? Because I think, to Liz's point, right, there's a huge difference in being an SRE at a Honeycomb or a 100-person startup versus, the first SRE hire at a even smaller startup than that versus being part of a huge SRE team at both like planet scale companies like Google, but also, major companies that are like, think Ticketmaster, right? Think about these brands you've heard of that have been around for a while that are modernizing and moving to the cloud and trying to integrate vastly, enormously complex systems. They also need SRE, but what SRE is and what it does and what it looks like at each of those, is very different. So,
and you shouldn't try to just copy Google, right? Like there is no what, just because Google came up with it first does not mean that it's the right way to do in your organization.
Yeah.
What was the common phrase? You are not Google. Like I swear that was a thing for a while, right? You are not Google. That's okay. It's okay to not be Google. That's maybe you're not even consumer facing.
Probably pretty good to not be Google in a lot of ways. I mean,
yeah, for sure.
The secret, the dirty secret, right, is that the more we, I don't want to say cargo cult because I feel like that's a very, pick your reasons for not liking the term, right? But there is a real problem with the way like tech, the way we think about and conceptualize technological movements or like roles is where we're patterning ourselves after what, bigger, more successful companies are doing, but we don't have,
or at least say what they're doing.
Well,
right?
yes,
like,
that too. That's the bigger problem.
Just because Google says that they do it does not mean that they universally do it.
I've heard this story from people I know that are like Zooglers, and they're talking about how funny it is that SRE rolled up to to completely different people than actually were the ones that were like responsible for the systems, right? Like SRE was almost an outsiders movement in a lot of ways to professionalize this work that was being done, this really invisible work. And I think that's important, right, for the industry, that we can figure out, that we can identify like, hey, you're working on this stuff over here, I'm working on that stuff over there. We actually have more in common than we have, that splits us apart. So let's figure it out together, and let's build things that are useful for kind of what we're doing and for people that are doing stuff like what we're doing. And you need a name, right? So it could have been SRE, but it also could have been, Princess Bunny Flops or something, right? It's a convenient name. It kind of encapsulates the what, the why, the how. But I think people get caught up on the name sometimes.
It's easy to make. I remember the debates about DevOps, and you put Devops Engineer in your title, and that I think the good thing about a term like that is it's not defined by a manifesto or some restrictive definition. It's something that evolves, just like going site to system. And, what's SRE today? And we're going to talk about kind of where it's going. It's going to evolve and change. It has to be matched to you and your organization and you and your skills too, right? It's not like the prescriptive way you do these 8 things, you are SRE. No, there's a lot of different things to apply to it. And not all of it's going to fit if you're a large bank or a credit union, a company. Very different kind of challenges. And I think that's part of what's interesting, I think, about SRE is it's not prescriptive as in a set of step. It's prescriptive as in helping the organization advance.
And also saying these are some key capabilities we think you should do.
Oh, we'll say more. Yeah.
Right. I do strongly believe that it is important for SREs to have some metrics to guide their visibility into system performance. And we traditionally use service level objectives for that. And I think it's important for SREs to be a engineering rather than pure operations function, right? I think those are two of the things that we can pretty universally agree upon, that SLOs are important regardless of size of org, that trying to keep a bound on your toil, as we call it, the kind of amount of manual work, is important to make sure that you do not have your life consumed by doing ops the old way. And instead that we're writing automation, we're kind of improving systems proactively rather than reactively.
I think you started on this path, but when you're living in the engineering world, you kind of get what that means. Maybe if you aren't, your operations kind of moving there. What does it mean to be engineering focused versus just operations focused? Can you expand a little bit more, Liz, and folks jump in?
Sure. I mean, I feel I've been hogging the mic. Someone feel free to jump in over me. But basically, when we say that SRE originated as having software engineers take that mindset towards operations at Google, the view was really that you should not accept doing manual automatable work as your status quo, that you should be always trying to automate yourself out of a job. You should be always working with higher leverage tools, right? Like working on the software automation rather than manually being in the fields, like, shoveling away technical debt.
Yeah, I think there's like a couple stories from ye olden days and even today. I remember when I was at my last job talking to one of our we had a big not a big, but we had an internal data center, right? Like they were very proud of it because they built a special room for it in the headquarters, and you could walk in and it was all glass. And it was, the thing that you would show all the interviewees. It's like, oh, here's our data center. It's like 4 racks. It's not anything.
Did you have the pretty glowing lights too behind glass so everyone could see how pretty? Yeah,
and I remember one time I got the IT guy to bring in a a fog machine, and that was like, we're moving to the cloud. Everyone got a kick out of it. But I remember talking to our IT guys, and they were operations people, right? But what does that, what does it actually mean? Like, what was the real distinction between the things that I got tasked to do as sort of a platform engineer or a DevOps engineer or whatever, and what they got asked to do? It's like, well, I'm writing Python or Go, I guess very early Go automation to control like VMware, and they're clicking things in a GUI. And what I think is funny is that over time, I've gone and I've talked to people that work at very, very, very large companies whose title is DevOps engineer. And it's like, well, what's your process? And it's like, well, someone submits a ticket, and then I go into the AWS console and I provision them an EC2 instance by clicking on things. It's like, oh, right.
The other anti-pattern that I've seen that's super weird is organizations having both DevOps teams and SRE teams, where it's almost like DevOps has become conflated with maintaining CI/CD infrastructure, right? Whereas in reality, both people who come from this kind of DevOps background, as well as people who come from the SRE implementation of DevOps background, should care about making release processes automatable, should care about making production reliable and understandable.
Well, I mean, we should all care about that stuff too, right? Like that's
it. But the challenge that I saw, so I was in, I think technically I was in operations long ago, and when we used stone tablets, of course. And back in those days, the whole mentality was engineering was throwing it over some proverbial fence to us, and we had to then keep it running. And I think the shared goal mentality was, well, we both want to keep the site up, or we both want these systems to work, so the money flows or whatever's happening that is so important to the business. You find yourself getting abstracted so much from what is important because that long ago, we could get metrics, but they weren't necessarily collected in a good place. They weren't easily accessible or transparent, most importantly, to everyone involved. And so now you have this problem where it's they said this, they said that, and you don't know who's right, and whoever was louder could win. And that's now, you fast forward to where we are, maybe where we're going in the future as well, with the efforts both of you have made as far as open telemetry and tracing and ways of seeing this in a very objective way. So instead of, I used to scream all the time, it's like Litko's on a rant again. And it's like, well, I'm sorry, but here's what I'm seeing. And I would run off of intuition. And that's the worst and the best thing simultaneously. And what would happen is I would never be able to produce the logs until I finally could. And of course, you'd have a lot of the Schrodinger's cat problem, right? I turned the logging on, but now my system acts totally differently because I'm trace level logs or whatever it might be. Yeah. And finally, they'd come around and they'd be like, okay, he was right the whole time. Well, that's not what I wanted. That was not my goal. My goal was, let's get this site back performing as it's supposed to. Let's get off of these never-ending conference bridges and calls and those things. And what I often found funny was, as I started hearing teams being referred to as DevOps, and I've always kind of laughed at titles. That's why my title's different everywhere you look at me, by the way, and that's intentional. I've always laughed at titles. It's more about what you bring or what you're doing. And to me, the thing that I found funny was they were like, instead of anyone flinging anything over any fences now, they have to be on call with us, was what all the former operations people would say and trying to entice me. And I'm like, weren't you all in the same boat together? Like, if this is going down, it's bad. Like, we want to bail the water out? Don't we want to make things better?
Yeah, that's that thing about shared responsibility. And as we try to scale the SRE movement, even shared responsibility may not be enough. And I think that, going to your question at the beginning, Mitch, where's this going next? I think the next big thing is having teams own their own software with support from platform engineering and giving them the right tools to help them be able to own their own software. That you shouldn't have to have an SRE assigned to your team, or even worse, a team of SREs assigned to your team in order to run software scalably.
I've kind of been, there's something I've been saying, like, to kind of talk about observability for a second in the context of this. Observability is almost like the wind or the water, right? It's the substrate of things you're building. And I see SRE, I feel like maybe we're kind of in a now and also into the, or maybe looking a little into the future. We're kind of like, what's over the next hill? Is moving towards this idea of SREs as a function that is providing the air and the water to you as an engineering team, or you own this service, or you own this group of services, and you need to know, like, well, what's going on? What's, I have to focus on what I'm doing. I know I have a ton of cross-cutting concerns because I know that my service lives in a society of, so to speak. How do I actually get all that data? How does it, delivered to me? How do I even learn what to look for? I think this is one of those, this is maybe a slightly different topic that we'll get into in another thing, but what does observability even mean, like, at an organizational level, right? Like, everyone kind of has their own definition, I feel like, some days. And not every definition works for everyone, just like not every SRE definition works for everyone. So,
Austin, I think one of the things that all of us are describing is, we talk about observability, but in general, it's really visibility to what's happening in an operational environment for developers, for management, for metrics. I mean, because I too lived in the age of, throw it over the wall, and all we cared about was uptime and whether we got a call from operations or a page back in those days. Mm-hmm. And this is, SRE has helped both elevate the visibility of what's happening in a production environment, and other things have too. But it's also helped break down some silos and help people work together on many of those problems. It's not like, okay, who's going to get the developer out of bed to get on the call?
And I think that's a huge difference between the older style of ops-driven APM, where you had to treat the software as a black box, where you were forbidden from making changes to the code, right? Due to false perceptions of, oh, we have to be SOX compliant. You can't possibly own the code and also run it in prod, right? Like, no, we have the 2-person rule, right? Like, we do code reviews. That's how you have one team that has accountability and review responsibility and can still own its code in production, right? So kind of by shifting the instrumentation left to be able to then be able to have production observability, I think that's a revolutionary shift compared to in the past, where you had the throwing the software over the wall, and then saying, you have to use, this automatic Java bytecode stuff to be able to understand it.
I love that you brought up the hiding behind regulations, though, as well as an excuse to not change.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you see that over and over with all these kind of title shifts. It's like, well, no, but we're PCI. That's a PCI environment. You can't do that there. And I'm like, well, okay, so wait a minute.
Separation of duties, right?
Right. And Liz, that was great. Like, you're talking about two people. This is how we help solve that problem. You have sign-offs on the commits and Git, whatever it might be. That's the thing I think it's lost. And I've been using the phrase clutching their pearls, and I don't remember where exactly it comes from, but I've used that way too often in the last few weeks, because I'll talk to people and they're like, oh, this is how we do it, but we need to put it through change control first. And I'm like, wait, you want to be fast and dynamic, but you also want to wait for some committee to be okay with this. Like, help me understand how you can have both. Like,
and also, how is that committee going to have the relevant context and state to know whether that change is good, as opposed to just acting as a rubber stamp?
So on this exact topic, I wrote a blog post last year talking about how SRE is actually the way that anarchists find like common cause at your company and try to take it down from the inside. I mean, okay, the last part's kind of a joke, but I do really believe in my thesis, which is like, if you look at, all of these transformational shifts in how we like organize work, right? Because a lot of SRE in a lot of ways is really about is how do we organize the process of doing work at a company, and who has responsibility for what, and who's accountable for what, right? So Agile was a way there was an imbalance. It was like, oh, too many PMs, too many too many lawyers, too many whatever, right? Like, the way that we do stuff as programmers, as this creative engineering discipline, that's all being taken away from us. Our power has been ripped from us by the bean counters. So we're going to do something called Agile, where it pulls it back, and it's like, okay, customers, stakeholders, engineers, we're going to wrest it back to our side and actually get stuff done. And then Agile got commoditized, and it turned into something that you can go to Deloitte and buy like a training package for. And if you go out and look at Google Deloitte Agile landscape or whatever, and find one of the most terrifying infographics that predates the cloud native landscape, you'll see, right? Like, we let the consultants come back in and they screwed it all up. And so DevOps is a response to that. And DevOps became, it's like, think Phoenix Project or whatever. And it's like, oh, if you look at it, it's the same stuff. We're talking about the same stuff. How does work get done? Who does work get done for? Who sets the standards of like accountability and, picking winners and losers and all that? And it's all about, well, DevOps says the people that are doing the work should probably have some more say in it, right?
And it should ship more incrementally, right? I think that's too important not to leave out, is that DevOps is the extension of Agile, which originally, as stated before it got corrupted by consultants, was the idea that we were going to ship units of work in smaller increments rather than doing this giant waterfall mess.
And yes, and then SRE, right, follows naturally that's the reaction to DevOps being commoditized.
Yeah, I mean, you might have just tipped your hand at the future of what SRE is that we're going to have to come up with another name, another sort of approach.
I already alluded to that, right? Like platform engineering, right? Like the idea that we are now building platforms that developers can use to self-service, rather than trying to insert ourselves into you must go through a production readiness review and then we'll take the pager for you, right? Like, no, that was the way Google did it in 2005 to convince developers that it was a model worth adopting. You do not have to reproduce that dysfunction from 2005.
Let me ask a question where
we find names we figure out names for things really easily. So I think we'll figure it out.
And then we're really good at subverting what those
names and then we're good. Then the subversion part. That's
so. The question: what's your experience with the adoption cycle for people to kind of bring up SRE in their organization, start to get some support momentum for it? Is it a ground up sort of thing and it happens and suddenly, hey, we should change my title? Is there support we need to get from operations or dev or engineering management to help us along that journey? You all have worked with so many different companies. Maybe Brian, why don't you jump in? You deal with a certain aspect of it with your company, Stormforge, around performance management and optimization, or Kubernetes, which is one slice of course, what SRE is like. How do people get this rolled out into their team, their group, their company?
I see almost only two profiles, and I hate to be so 0 or 1, but guess what? I guess I'm an engineer at heart. Everything's 0 and 1. There's two different folks I talk to. The first one I talk to is the folks who already have an SRE function, at least with those 3 letters put next to one another. We can debate what they do and what they accomplish, but in those organizations, it's really easy. It's really, really easy to kind of talk about, here's what we're going to do, here's where we fit in. Like what we'll do at StormForge, we'll take their observability metrics and use those as ways to optimize the settings they have in their Kubernetes manifest and how they've deployed their apps. So basically, instead of saying, hey, you need 4,000 millicores of CPU, guess what? You only need 400. And I've got the data from your own system to kind of show that to you. Those SREs get it right away. But then the other folks I talk to are the ones who, if they use SRE as a term at all, it's absolute lip service. It's I was joking with a colleague this morning about how I used to say the CIO read it in a magazine. I guess the modern equivalent of that is the CIO got a blog emailed to them because they wouldn't actually go to the website where they'd read it themselves. But nonetheless, they're doing it more maybe to attract talent in a very weird sort of perverse way. And they don't actually understand what it means. And these are the ones who ask us about, well, wait, where does change management fit in? And I'm like, look, if I'm optimizing your Kubernetes environment and I change your app on the fly and you don't accept that change within moments, my recommendation to make that change is dated and therefore useless, because maybe now you've had a load surge on your site and you're getting a lot more traffic or something. So it's kind of funny. And obviously there's gray area between these two, but I've seen a very distinct fork in the road between the two approaches. And it's unfortunate because these folks who are still lip servicing it, or, again, read it in a magazine, pushing it down from the top, they are going to constantly be in a circle of chasing the buzzword. And you'll get lucky by having the fortunate few who have a passion about either the company or getting their paycheck or their own pride. And maybe they're building a brand for themselves in the open source community, where they'll push it and make it happen. But it's in spite of the direction, not because of the direction of the higher ups. That was a soapboxy sort of moment there.
I don't disagree a bunch with some of that. I've seen some very successful efforts to bring SRE in from the top down. I think that happens when you have a executive champion for reliability and for empowering the people that are going to become SREs with the resources to really, truly take ownership, to become coaches to the team, to kind of drive the idea of fast delivery cycles, adequate observability, SLOs into the organization.
I would kind of split the difference just to make it fun. Well, I think Liz is right. Like, I've personally never seen like a super successful SRE or observability program be implemented without extremely strong. I also want to caveat this. I've never seen a successful, like a really successful culture change without it being driven by someone at the top. Just like, you have to, it's not, and this isn't even a buy-in thing. This is a SRE and observability, and all of this stuff is fundamentally about changing a lot of things that make like hierarchical business kind of decisions very uncomfortable. Like, it's about taking power and taking it away from people that are maybe used to having power. So you need people at the top that are willing to invert that pyramid and say, well, yeah, we need to give the people that are down in the trenches, so to speak, more flexibility, more ability, more independence, stuff like that. And that is literally impossible to do without at least some level of protection or acceptance or whatever up here. Someone that tries to come in at the bottom and faces an inflexible management structure that says, well, we have to have PCI DSS compliance, we have to have change control. Like, it's never going to work. Sorry. Like, you're going to burn up or burn out. Like, those are your two. I feel like those are your two options.
I think what I saw was that it only went so far. So I didn't get to see any of these executives who supported the reliability function, but that's because I think a lot of the organizations I worked with were too busy trying to implement the hotness of 3 years ago, and we're taking so long to do that they're constantly tail chasing. But at the same time, like, you have support to a level. So if you get that groundswell, or you get the subversive movement that's making it happen, right? The coalition of the willing, you'll meet a point of resistance somewhere in the organization. And I used to very, I don't know, pessimistically look at it as someone who's like holding on to their job security. It's like, well, if I don't approve that change, then what do I do?
Yep.
And I'd have so little, I mean, I struggle, right? I want to have empathy and sympathy for them. Like, I feel sorry that you didn't keep up with more skills than a rubber stamp. Like, good for you that you know how to refill the ink for your rubber stamper. But gosh, the world's been changing around you. Did you ever like take your head up and look? And
But
it's
the
a
thing is,
challenge.
right, like these people shouldn't feel like their job security is threatened because they have this wealth of institutional knowledge that they should be spreading across the organization and training and up leveling, right? Like that is a valuable role for them to fill if that is something that the organization is willing to reward, rather than just rewarding the, you're the gatekeeper with the rubber stamp.
And beyond even like that, like, I mean, someone that's in change control, I think is like change of review boards is an interesting thing here because it's almost fundamentally at odds with an SRE movement. So how do you kind of it requires a lot of like first principle sort of interrogation of like, well, what are we actually saving ourselves from, right? Like, and those are the people that are going to have the institutional knowledge to help figure out, well, how do we automate some of this, right? Like, there's
not only how do we automate some of this, but I think there are valuable functions to cross-pollination of knowledge about how systems work, how systems fail, right? Like, just because you are blowing up the change control board does not mean that there shouldn't be some kind of community of practice for systems engineers or for site reliability engineers. And traditionally, that's been the change control board, right? Like where the blessed architects review things, but I don't think it has to be that way. And one of the practices that I actually wish people adopted from Google more, if they're adopting things rubber stamp out of Google, is the idea of doing these kind of regular semi-public perspectives to help people review the incidents that have happened over the past 2 months in a blameless fashion, so that people can all learn from what's happened across the org. That, to me, serves an infinitely better purpose because it illuminates all of that source data as to why people push back on things at change control board rather than just saying no.
Yeah. I think also there's, and it's there's other things, right? Like the sort of traditional kind of ops functions, right, of alert review and stuff like that. Well, there's no reason that you can't have, those sort of standard setting bodies of people that are saying, well, here's the rules of the road and here's what we need to keep things within and but you can do it in a different way, and you can do it in an open way, and you can do it in a way that is continuously like generating feedback to put into the system. But again, like I said earlier, all that really does require like quite a bit of buy-in at pretty high levels of an engineering organization. It's I think there's a lot of interest. Like, this is something you could actually do another whole hour on, right? Of like, how does this exactly fit in? Can you do this? Can you do this through like centers of excellence or whatever? Spoilers, no.
Well,
but
there's a difference between a center of excellence and a community of practice.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like we bump up against and challenge some of the things like information hoarding. That kind of culture is not going to react well. Maybe where there's a high concentration of control, like I run the change control board, you have to bow to me, kind of thing. But we're not only distributing knowledge, we're distributing control with some common. Yes, we need to meet
control
regulations,
and data,
SLOs,
right? Like
all of those things.
I think that kind of democratization of data is something that Austin and I are very much in agreement about, right? Like, despite working at companies that are nominally competing, right? Like, we're about up-leveling your engineers.
It's so important. Well, the other thing that what I was going to mention is I think you also need a little bit of advocacy internally for this. Like, someone needs to be beating the drum or celebrating the successes that come from that democratization of the data, from the insights gained from seeing it, and how, like, everyone, it's a human nature thing, right? The comment box. I always talk about this. You have a comment box at a restaurant where, hey, leave us feedback. How did we do? And human nature. I don't have the study to cite for you all to give you the best data, but it's something about how 9 out of 10 times is because you had a negative experience, and you're not as motivated when you have a positive experience because you just expect that. And I think we get so spoiled by the fact that we have fantastic uptimes, and we're measuring them. You remember when 3 nines was something to like just be astonished by, and now here we are, 5 nines is common language with people flirting beyond that. I mean, it's a different world now.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I
find it the fetishization of nines is the problem, though, right? Like, people demanding more nines than they need. I mean, hell, right? Like, I know this sounds weird, but 20 years ago, early 2000s, right? Like, there were ads in Fortune magazine for this server can achieve 5 nines, right? Like, with Microsoft and Intel technologies, and it's like, you sure that's the right thing to do, right? Like, I think the nines have been around for a while, but I think the saying, it's about customer happiness. It's not necessarily about the number of paper nines.
Well, you may not be keeping up with the business and the market and, other factors, not just about uptime.
So to tie this back to what Liz was saying earlier about SLOs, this is why SLOs are so important, right? SLOs are I think if you actually had to pick one thing out of this conversation, there's a lot of things you could pick, but I absolutely think SLOs are if there's like one enduring legacy of SRE, and what I think it'll be extremely useful for in the future is being the people that introduce, that shepherd SLOs into wide adoption in a company or in an engineering team, because they are that's how, like you were saying, hey, we got to how do we celebrate the wins? How do we communicate the value of this to those C and X level people? And how do we communicate it? And I would say beyond that, how do we communicate it to customer support? And how do we communicate it to business analysts and finance? And how do we communicate it to sales reps and literally everyone? Because
and
there's
our
no
customers
and our customers, but there's no business that doesn't run without software, right? Like the software is the core of everything we're doing. Even if you're not a technology company, you're still a technology company. Like SLOs are the way to kind of communicate that value and help people understand this is what engineering does. This is what engineering is doing. This is how we're you want to make customers happy? We want to make customers happy. Here's how we're doing it. And we can all understand that.
It's two-way visibility, right? What's happening from the customer's viewpoint or the business metrics as well as inside technology. Right?
Liz?
There's a really fascinating thing here, though, which is that a lot of what I encountered when I was at Google evangelizing SRE and SLOs to Google Cloud customers was that there's this pushback of, okay, we have yet another business metric that goes up on a wall somewhere, and we'll review once every 3 months, right? Like, and that challenge is, how do we make it actionable, right? Like, how do we make it so that you're able to drill down from, I blew my SLO to why is this happening? How is this happening? And kind of bridging that gap is how I really got into the field of observability, to realize that that's the tangible connection between this high-level business metric and how do we actually debug it as engineers, rather than taking a guess that the SLO is burning because the CPU alarm is slapping, right? As opposed to, we can actually drill down and understand, okay, the SLO is burning. Why? Okay, now I know how it's broken. Now I can fix it.
How do you avoid the metric fatigue element too? Because I think anytime something is up on a board, you just get used to it. You're just like, okay, well, that's always that way, and this is what I must do, right? It's the number, it's red. I've got to turn it green. And it's
the problem. The reason people get metric fatigue is because nobody looks at SLOs as or they look at them as an and, right? So what people hear, I think, a lot of times when they hear me or Liz or whoever talking about SLOs, they're like, oh, another thing. It's like, this is another thing I've got to report upward, or I've got to put on my dashboard up here on the TV. And I think that's where we get on the wrong foot, because no, you should throw all that stuff away.
Yes, clear the board of everything else.
Clear the board, put the SLOs up there. That's all you do from here on out. Right,
and then it becomes a virtuous thing to turn the SLO from red to green.
Right.
If you have good hygiene and your SLO is usually green, right? Then and you have the capability to debug it to turn it from red to green, right? Like, that makes that actually a cycle where you are able to do the engineering changes and kind of do the debugging that you need.
Yep. We had a really good something that you can do with your other teams, right? Outside of engineering, right? You can do SLOs for hiring. You can do SLOs for whatever. It's not
right.
I recommend the Alex Hidalgo, book on SLOs. And if you read it, it's very good. But it also gets into a lot of really complicated math, and that I feel like scares some people off. You don't even have to get into the complicated math. There are lightweight versions of this, it's about connecting things we do to the actual customer experience. And maybe that customer is our candidates that are looking for interviews. Maybe it's to managers that are trying to fill their teams. Maybe it's to people that are trying to, maybe it's TAMs and people that are trying to understand how quickly are we burning through roadmap stuff, or waiting for engineers to be available, or whatever, right? Maybe it's your DevRel team trying to figure out where they can go this year. I don't know, right? But it's again, It's not saying here's a new thing to add to your pile of stuff that you don't look at already. It's take the pile of stuff you don't look at already, throw it in the dumpster, and do the good stuff instead. Sometimes you have to be blunt. Like the current dashboards don't work. They don't help. They make understanding worse. There's a really good.
I always have the
blog
saying
post
that
on
dashboards
Honeycomb.
are technical debt, right? Like they reflect your last 20
Yeah.
outages, not the next outage that you're going to have.
The Honeycomb Fred over at Honeycomb wrote an extremely good blog about that I'm getting the name wrong, but basically burn your dashboards, and I 100% undersign.
There's that anarchist theme again.
I love fire.
It's kind of speaking of that. Chris in the Q&A asked a question about how do you go from a change control, structured control environment to more of a DevOps or SRE type of environment? Is there still a role for change control, or is it just no? You got to blow that up. That's backwards from what we need to do.
Change control is done by your teammates, right? By the people who have the most context to understand what's happening. So when we talk about blowing up change control, what we mean is not, sending it upwards to a group of people who have no idea what's going on or just rubber stamping things once a week, right? Like what we're saying is do code review by the person that's sitting next to you within an hour or two of you writing the change. That is the kind of extent of review, of getting a second set of eyes who have the relevant context to understand the intent behind the change.
I would also add to that most of the time, a lot of people that have like change review don't understand how much change happens that the review completely misses. There's, if you have a sufficiently complex system, there is a quite literal infinite spider web of complexity that you can't see. And I think that the change board acts as a security blanket in a lot of ways, to make us feel like we have control over a system that every day we have increasingly less control over. So
yeah, and it's this really funny thing. When I was working on Google Cloud, a consortium of banks came to us and said, hi, we'd like to adopt Google Cloud or Amazon, right, like as our kind of banking cloud. And by the way, as part of our change control processes, we want you to give us a list of updates every time that a software update is made to a machine that our software could run on. And I was like, this is meaningless, right? Like you're going to get a list of, the kernel changed on this machine, the underlying, job scheduling software changed on this machine, right? Like, and it's completely disconnected, right? Like going that safety blanket illusion, right? It gives you the illusion that if something goes wrong, you understand where it came from. But in reality, it doesn't, because it's just noise.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing that I was looking for though as well is I remember one function of a change control board, and this is a long time ago, so maybe it's no longer relevant. Sometimes a team who is making a impactful change, they know their environment, they know their inputs and outputs, they know their interfaces, but they don't realize that, oh, by the way, the network team's doing maintenance at that exact same time. You might not be able to, your push might not go because it can't get from here to there at that same time. And that's what I just kind of wonder aloud, like, where does that function fall into all of this? And my gut instinct says, well, I need to make my system reliable enough that it knows that it couldn't deploy at that time, and that's fine, and it will retry indefinitely or within parameters and things like that, right? We have to build more resilience into our own components. Is that the answer to my own question?
Yeah.
And also sharing that state, right, to make it visible to other people on your upstream and downstream services, what's going on in your service.
To Liz's point earlier, that's like platform engineering, right? Like you need someone that builds the Google Maps, so to speak, of your system, or provides the tools. And so if you go into Google Maps, you pull up the thing and it's like, is there traffic ahead of me? And you, oh yeah, there's traffic, right? So you need tools like that. There's service catalog. There's a lot of like technical ways to solve this that aren't super interesting. But I think that should be the model you're taking, is that there is a team of people that are like providing you the tools to make sure that your system, that you are building your components in a resilient way by giving you access to that information. And really it becomes a bit less fragile, because now it's not, there's a team of people having an 5-hour meeting every week to figure out like, okay, do this, to structure and sequence all this stuff. It's just like, oh no, I can just check I can go boop, boop, boop. Oh yeah, there's construction.
Well, I love the gamification of that too, because that's the other thing, we were talking about the kind of getting bored of the dashboards being useless. Well, they've lost their fun. I don't know if they ever had any, but they've lost it, right? If you don't have some neat way to see the flow of what this is doing, you're never going to go look at it. If you had to go look at YAML or XML, heaven forbid, like that's not the way to find out how this is working. You need something. Most humans are at least somewhat visual. So I think that
and I think that goes to that question that we're seeing in the chat here about kind of how do you have your devs feel like they have a sufficient amount of kind of ops competency, right? And I think the answer to that is by making ops more accessible, by making it so that you can easily debug and understand things and see what's going on in your system contextualized with your code. That's how you make dev and ops no longer feel like they're separate disciplines, instead more of a spectrum that you can kind of drift along as you prefer.
Yeah.
I feel like we're kind of dipping in and out of, today and where we're going next. Maybe we can explore some more about what's sort of next on the horizon. We talked a lot about, visibility and making things known of what's happening and getting away from control and those things. What's next for SRE?
To take it in a slightly different direction, one thing that I hope is next is, I didn't bring this up before, but I think it's kind of relevant because I especially when I look at the chat and I see people's kind of responses, there's a lot of, shall we say, engineering chauvinism in the formalization of like SRE as a discipline. And to kind of expound on what I mean there, I don't think it's saying anything surprising that, back in the day and even today, like programmers tend to view their jobs as a little more important than the people racking servers, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's where SRE is so innovative, right? Because it said systems engineering and software engineering are of equal value. Yes. And here's how we're going to bring them together under the umbrella of SRE.
And I completely agree with that, right? But we're kind of backing our way into a solution by kind of coming up to the level of being like, well, okay, yeah, it actually matters if this has like discipline behind it. I think if you look at like the tenor of our answers, they're all very, we tend to be very matter of fact, right? Like burn your dashboards, right? It's great advice, gulag the change committee, the change review board. Like this is all stuff that is easy to say when like it's my job to go out and have hot takes and try to help people, but it's obviously very difficult to do in a lot of organizations because there is so much momentum. And as much as like executives say we want change, they also have like very strict contractual requirements around, to your example about like, oh, give us everything every time the software updates on a GCP instance. Like a lot of that's just stuff that's in contracts. It has to go through lawyers. This is a big systemic problem, right? So what I would love to see is how does SRE, like as SRE goes into the future, how do we make it something that is more, we take the parts of these lessons and these teachings that we can and make them broadly applicable and broadly useful by people in a way that doesn't require everyone to just kind of like, get up on the Bastille and raise the flag of revolution first. Because as much fun as revolution is, I don't know how helpful it is to the people that are actually experiencing these pain points today.
Yeah, there are so many software engineering teams that are never going to have their own SRE team or even like an SRE attached to their teams. How do we make their lives easier too, right? Yeah. And that's why I think Austin and I are so passionate about observability, right? Because that is a mechanism for giving software engineers better tooling to be able to understand what's happening in production.
Also, mea culpa on word choice back there. Thank you for pointing that out in chat.
No worries.
Thank you for owning it. The thing I think from a future-looking or forward-looking perspective as well, the work that the open telemetry community has done is making it easier to have these metrics embedded in frameworks. So someone who was like, I don't want to have to figure this out, they don't have to anymore. That's going to make life easier. So we're going to have more and more data to work with. I think having the data is step one. Like you can't act on data if you don't have the data. So at least gathering more data, gathering more metrics. I speak out of complete ignorance here, but I'd like to think that we can get more out of our platforms and out of our infra to inform what's going on all over the place. Mm-hmm. And I think the cloud providers are getting better about that in general too. So you're going to see a lot more
DevOps people and like ops people are not gatekeeping that info anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that'll help.
And once we have that information, then I think that we also get to start doing interesting stuff in the field of like, okay, what does it mean to be on call, right? Like, there's a lot of functions that kind of get assigned arbitrarily, I think, to SRE teams. And as SRE maybe transitions to more of a like, okay, here's like the enduring lessons of SRE, and then the SRE teams become platform engineering teams, and we get to really talk about how can we use technology to improve a lot of the rote functions. So incident response, run books, simply knowing what's going on, SLOs. That you can chalk off 100 different things here, but I liked your gamification. I like you phrase it as gamification, which is interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I do think that maybe is kind of the next step for these teams, is figuring out, well, how do we make it more fun and interesting? How do we like build better workflows for people? How do we take all this different data, including things like customer analytics, right? Or user, like, not just like, oh, is the system up, but is like, well, are people clicking the things we want them to? How often are people having to go click the help button? All that stuff that's all kind of siloed off and off in the product manager world. How do we bring that back into the engineering loop? I really see
anytime we can make
SREs
this fun, right? Like anytime, that's what I meant by saying gamification. I suppose I used a poor example of it, but
no, I think it's good
to
to
make it fun.
I do think it's like, the SREs are kind of the people that help make the work get done better and more fun and faster.
Reducing toil, right? It's also part of it.
Like Liz said, reduce toil.
Reduce toil, get people on the same page of that reliability is a product feature that a product manager can reason about, and that engineers can manage to that metric without having it become this kind of disjoint thing where people have this false idea, oh, we're reliable enough. The dashboard says we have 5 nines, right? As opposed to
right.
My dashboard isn't red. We're okay.
My dashboard says 5 nines. By the way, that's a completely synthetic metric that someone added.
It's a static page.
Yeah. It's
just I have so much beef with Gartner.
Vanity. There's another episode. Your dashboard doesn't matter.
Right? Like people are like, but can I get, synthetics on my dashboard? And I'm like, well, synthetics don't actually reflect real user experience. We should be using real user experience.
Yes.
We sub-optimize for what we measure off.
We optimize for the experience of our Selenium runners and nothing else.
So parting topic. We have about 8 minutes left. I need to give Cody a few minutes to do some wrap up and hand out some gift cards. Where are we in the SRE evolution of SRE and what it is? Are we still in the sort of first or second inning of this, the baseball analogy, first quarter of the football game? Are we kind of in second half of we're really coming together and gaining momentum? Where are we in this evolution? Because it seems to me we're just barely scratching the surface. There's a lot of fantastic things that are happening. I think there's a lot more that can happen as more that this surfaces and we get people working together. Thoughts?
It depends on what you define as the ball game, right? Like I think the old anime adage of like, this is not even my final form, right? Like I think that's what's happening with SRE, is that there's always this thing of people are quick to jump on the Agile or the DevOps or the SRE bandwagon, but people are always kind of thinking about and building what's next. And I think that what's next is platform engineering, and that is relatively nascent. Whereas I think SRE is fairly well understood and is being adopted by more and more blue chip companies. So I think in that aspect, it's pretty well played out.
Yeah. I think, and if you think about it, like maybe people think of SRE as like a new thing, but foundationally, I would kind of put its roots at places like Google and AWS and places that, the first kind of planet scale companies, right? And that puts it at about 20 years old,
Yep.
That's pretty old for a technology.
In a lot of ways, though, Amazon was ahead of that game because Amazon never adopted the word SRE. Amazon always was saying, we have to have 2 pizza teams. We have to empower those 2 pizza teams to run their own services, which I think, almost skipped an evolutionary step there, which is kind of cool.
Or didn't limit themselves by defining it by a single term, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess to go back to the beginning, like, yes, that's the power of names, right? Like when you get to name something, you kind of inherently scope it. But yeah, I broadly agree with Liz. Like SRE is definitely, it's a mature discipline. The lessons of SRE, the things it has to teach us, like we're not seeing a ton of innovation. What we're seeing is actual applications of the theory, which I think feels like innovation to a lot of people. But again, not a lot that's, there's not a lot of stuff that's truly new under the sun. What thing people are learning and why it feels exciting is because people are actually paying attention and doing the stuff that we've been telling them to do. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is great.
This works.
Yeah.
Well, the piece I'd add is that I think what I agree with both of you on the maturity aspects of the practice, but the thing that I think is still missing or could always improve is this. We live in a very open source friendly world. That was not always the case. Why are people not sharing more? Like, you have your conference, you have your books, you have your blogs, you have your podcast. Let's participate more together to make this better. Like, if we're sitting there in our own organizations and doing it all ourselves and keeping it to ourselves, we only helped ourselves. And maybe I'm expressing more virtue than I really have, but I'd love to see the world be a better place. So, if we could all collaborate and do it publicly in open source style, that would be even better. If I may.
There's this taboo about discussing reliability, though, right? Like, and I think that that's something that many organizations have to get over, that fear, and realize that they have better customer experiences if they talk with their customers about like their reliability challenges and how they're improving.
And help and understand like their actual expectations and not their like contractual expectations.
Yeah. Nice.
I think it's but we need, so it's what's the poop happens book? We need that errors happen. We need that and
They're
give
expected.
it to, yes, errors are expected.
Required. Yeah, they are.
But I generally agree. I think it's actually been harder than usual with the pandemic. If there's one thing that people don't feel people feel a lot more comfortable talking about failure in person, I feel like, than online. Maybe it's because our generation, by that I mean elder millennial plus, never really got used to being extremely open.
I gotta go
online.
look that one up. I don't even know what this means. I gotta go look that up.
No. People born in like the early to mid 1980s. But I think even we were the first like part of the digital generation, but we never even got like that good at being like super online and just thinking of people online. So I think a lot of digital communities around tech professionals, especially at this level, tend to be very hyper optimistic, right? It's like Instagram. We don't talk about we filter off all the warts and we just talk about our successes and not our failures. There's also a bit of a bias in that, like, nobody wants to, I think every conference organizer I know would love for people to come talk about their failures more, but not a lot of hiring managers want to approve someone going to a conference talking about their failures, if that makes sense.
Yes, especially if you're representing an organization. Yeah.
But easier to talk about if you can talk about the failures, but how you got to a place where that informed you even more.
Right. Like, what can we learn from these failures?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But the problem is that most of the failures actually don't go. People don't learn from most. I feel like most people don't learn from all their failures in the way that they would like to. And I feel like the failures that we don't learn from, or that we didn't, like the things that went wrong that we didn't actually change, is almost a more instructive story for listeners than the ones that's like, everything blew up and then we fixed it and here's how we stopped it from ever happening again.
Right, like that assumes a lot about a kind of functional engineering process and feedback loops. Whereas, like, if your organization is more broken than that, unfortunately, the reality is that a lot of these organizations don't get fixed. People wind up leaving.
Yeah, but no one wants to go out and talk about that because they don't want to burn they don't want to burn bridges or whatever.
Yeah. I'm going to push pause. We're at the end of our time. You three are amazing. We could go all day as far as I'm concerned. Thank you so much. It's been amazing. And thanks to our audience. There's been some fantastic comments and some controversial, I would disagree, but that's what it's about. And somebody said, this is more like a podcast than a webinar. That's our goal.
I will say, chat, you all were great. I really loved the conversation. Lots of great questions. I know we didn't get to them all, but feel free to like bug any of us on Twitter, I imagine.
I was going to say, tweet the heck out of us. That's how I break the monotony of the day, right?
Excellent. Well, let's turn it back over to Cody. We have some gift cards to hand out.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. And I would also like to thank Brian, Liz, and Austin for taking time out of their busy schedule to join us today for this conversation. Quickly, we do have 4 gift cards to give away. These are for $25. Our first winner is Eli N. Our second winner is Chris B. Our third winner is Sandra or Sandra S. And our fourth and final winner is Talha Y. So congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. So I'd like to thank Lightstep, a ServiceNow company, for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks goes to you, our audience. We really appreciate you taking your time to be with us today to sit in on this conversation. And we'd like to also ask you to tune into Techstrong TV for future episodes of the SRE show. So this is part of a series. So again, please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey, and we hope to see you at a future Techstrong Learning webinar. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.